Hello and welcome to another edition of our Conversations with Sound Artists podcast. My name is Glenn Kiser. I'm the director of the Dolby Institute, and this podcast is a collaboration of the Dolby Institute and the SoundWorks collection. Really happy today to be on the Warner Brothers studio lot in Burbank, talking with my old friend Richard King. Richard, I'm going to embarrass a little bit by just saying Richard's a 3-time Academy Award winner for Best Achievement in Sound Editing for his work in Inception, The Dark Knight, and Peter Weir's film Master and Commander, and has another 2 nominations for Academy Award for Best Sound Editing for Interstellar and War of the Worlds, and also, quite wonderfully, in 2016 got the Career Achievement Award from the Motion Picture Sound Editors. So an incredibly well-respected and highly achieved member of our sound community. And Richard, I'm just thrilled that you would take the time to talk with us today about your long collaboration with Christopher Nolan. This particular series of conversations that we're doing in this season is about sound designers and sound editors who have had long collaborations with one director. So we're here today to talk with you about your work with Christopher Nolan, and I thank you for doing the show with us.
My pleasure.
So we were talking about this right before we started, but the first time you worked with Chris was on a movie called The Prestige in 2006, and then so obviously, you know, the big news at the moment is Dunkirk. As I was driving onto the lot this morning, the posters are everywhere. The movie's been out for a couple of weeks now, and I think you guys must be gratified by the success. It's I think a much bigger hit than even anybody really expected it to be.
Yeah, I'm so thrilled that people are responding to it, and not just as a historical piece, but as a dramatic film. I think it's clearly the right film at the right time. I think it's reached a lot of people because the themes are so relevant even today, and
it's just a great story.
It's a great story. It's really an important story for the British. It was a tremendously important moment in their history.
Right.
Very difficult moment that they rose to and lived through, and I think the world would be a much different and much darker place today if the events hadn't gone down as they did, if they hadn't managed to pull off that evacuation.
Right.
So it's an really important story, and it's also a war film that the conclusion of which doesn't involve the taking of territory or the capturing or killing of the enemy, but in the saving of people.
Right.
And in the saving of the British Army in this case. And
kind of a relentlessly positive war film, right?
Well, there's always this sense that the monster's coming, and it's on the other side of the hill, and it's getting closer, and it's inexorably getting closer and closer and closer, and nothing's going to stop it. Yeah. And once the British realized that, they realized they had to save their army, get them back to England.
Right.
And they basically concocted this entire convoy of ships. They corralled as many Royal Navy ships as they could. They cobbled the whole operation together in just a couple of weeks and managed the evacuation in, I think, 6 or 7 days. If that hadn't happened, England most certainly would have been invaded within months.
Right.
And
things could have worked out very
that
differently.
That would have been it.
Yeah, yeah. So, obviously I've got a lot of questions about Dunkirk, and I want to really dive into some of the work that you guys did on that. But before we get there, I really wanted to sort of kind of take a step back and ask you, like, how did the relationship with Chris start? How did you guys meet? Obviously Prestige was the first film, and it kind of came in at an interesting point in Chris's career. He had really been a very well-respected director of smaller independent films, and then he got Batman. And so you came into sort of his team of collaborators after that first Batman film. So how did you come onto the Prestige, and sort of what was your first experience of him?
Well, I had just worked with Lee Smith, picture editor, on Master and Commander. Lee cut Batman Begins and was cutting Prestige. And Lee introduced me to Chris, and we had a chat and got along, and I started working on the film.
Right. What do you think he was looking for when he first met you, and the kind of the, if I can cast your memory back to those first kind of conversations, what do you think he was looking for in a sound artist to work with?
I think he's looking for somebody that understands the material on multiple levels, that gets his aesthetic, someone that he can trust a little bit to understand what he wants to do and work in that direction, come on board his ship and work to that end. And I think, he, at that point, he didn't really know me very well. So I think he was using Lee's recommendation to a great extent.
Well, also you had just won an Academy Award for Master and Commander, so that doesn't hurt things.
Right. Certainly. So I had some cred.
Right.
And I did love the script and loved the material and found it very interesting what he did from the book to the script, what he used in the book. It's really, they're two totally different pieces of writing.
I've never read the book.
It's unrecognizable almost from the script. So I found his take on that story, his angle on that story, really, really cool. So yeah, it was just, and it's so fun to talk to people that have a strong vision. You can feel that in them, and you can, it's inspiring.
Sure. It brings out your best work.
Exactly. If they're able to show you what that vision is, to reveal that vision to you, then it's like, opening up a whole world.
Right.
And then in the process of working on the Prestige, we started to develop a little bit of a shorthand, and, he'd correct me when I was deviating down the wrong path. But it was a very good collaboration, and I really enjoyed working with him on Prestige.
Well, I'm curious to hear kind of what the process is of collaborating, with Chris on one of his films. At what point do you tend to get involved? Do you read the script before he goes out and shoots? Do you have conversations with him about it? And are you involved during production? And how does the post-production workflow go?
I usually am invited to read the script before they start shooting. And sometimes there's time for us to have a short chat before they go off and shoot. Sometimes not. On Dunkirk, we were able to have a short conversation before they left. I tend to respond more to images than to the written word as far as coming up with sound ideas. It's very abstract reading a script for me, and obviously can be interpreted by the director when shooting and cutting together in so many different ways that it's for me anyway, it's a little bit of the script is simply a kind of a rough roadmap of what's coming in the future.
Well, I imagine for on one of Chris's movies too, because obviously he's writing for himself to direct, so it may be a little bit more sparse than you would normally see in a film script coming in. I mean, he's obviously writing the script not only as a shooting script, but as a script for the studio to read,
department
heads and
everybody to read. So it's always a very good roadmap. I think it's just my psychology is such that I sonically respond more to images than to reading and imagining what those images are going to look like.
Right. So what might be that conversation that you would have with him before he would go shoot?
If he's already thinking about specific things that he knows are going to be important, he'll mention those to me. Ask me to start thinking about them. For instance, in Dunkirk, it was the Stuka sirens that we knew were going to be an important part of the audio story. So for the 2 or 3 people who won't have seen the film by the time when they hear this conversation, the Stuka. So you're talking about the German dive bomber planes that are coming in and strafing the beach, and they have a sound generating siren. That's part of the structure of the plane. It's a device that they cooked up before the war, and they're sirens that are affixed to the wheel struts, and they're wind operated. So there's a propeller on the front of them, about this big, about a meter, and it's a very elaborate system with a brake, so that when they're flying to the field, to the operation area, it's engaged, so it's not spinning. When the plane begins to dive, and it dives almost vertically, they release this brake and the propeller started to spin.
And it starts to
emit this howl. And there's also...
This served no purpose other than psychological
terror.
It
was a psychological terror weapon. And they did it probably less for the troops as much as the fleeing refugees, and basically would stop everybody on the road. It would also freak out horses. In those days, there was a lot of horse-drawn stuff in the military. They were still using horses. So it would terrorize the horses and basically just freak out anybody on the ground. And it was apparently a very, very loud sound. But it became more of like the calling card for the Stuka. So once the soldiers became accustomed to this sound, the pilots, German pilots, wanted to stop using them because they felt like it was giving them away.
Sure.
And these were already slow, unmaneuverable planes that had
These are not fighter jets.
These are not fighters, and they had to generally have a fighter escort because they were slow and they were targets for the RAF. Right. So they stopped using them by the Battle of Britain, which was just a few months after Dunkirk.
Yeah, interesting. So
that's something very short-lived.
It's very kind of specific to the sound of Dunkirk.
And that very, very early part of the invasion of France and Holland and Dunkirk in the very beginning of the war. And in researching this story, it became really fascinating because there's no Stukas left in the world that fly. There's none of these sirens left.
Nobody had these boxes left anymore?
That I could find. Because the other thing is they were very short-lived. So they were only on the planes for a couple of years, pre-war and beginning of the war. The Allies destroyed all of
I was about to say, presumably those planes were destroyed, right?
They destroyed everything. They wanted to reduce Germany's mischief-making abilities for a long time. So all that stuff is gone. I scoured all the German historical archives and wherever I could look, and basically there's just not much information about them, not even about how they're built. The sirens, I mean.
Yeah.
So we have these historical recordings that everyone's heard and that have been used in TV and movies for decades.
And where are those just sort of come out of like BBC archives or?
No, I think they were recorded by German newsreel crews before the war. And they were, if you listen to all of these, you can go on YouTube and find dozens of examples. It sounds to me, it's that they were from the same period in recording, that they were, if not done the same day or week, then certainly within the same year. And probably, according to the German historical archives, probably recorded on wax discs in the field. So quality was iffy to begin with.
You're not getting super clean recordings of those things.
You're getting super saturated recordings, which kind of may very well add something to the intensity of the sound.
Right.
And I wanted to retain that intensity without resorting to too much, just raw distortion. But it was clearly a very memorable sound to the men on the beach. They allude to this sound a number of times in the historical references.
It must have just been terrorizing. Yeah.
It was because the siren would actually be louder than the engine itself, and just this screaming thing coming straight down from the sky.
And you guys use that really effectively in the film. There are a couple of instances that I remember from my viewing of the film where and I may be misremembering it, but my impression was the track drops to things become very quiet. And then this screaming starts in a very specific point, then it just gets louder and louder and louder. And it just, the anxiety level starts to build for you.
Yeah. It was a long, interesting, quite fascinating process to come up with that sound and to have it evolve from the kind of this beginning distant howl that slowly becomes a scream that slowly just becomes this ear-piercing, almost animalistic.
Yeah. So without asking you to give away the secret sauce, how did you create the sound?
Well, I built a siren. I got an air raid siren and put it inside a steel drum, and we rigged it up, took it out in the desert, and fired it up. And that was sort of I would say, in quotes, the pure component of the sound. And it probably was not far from what they originally sounded like, because they were simply air raid sirens,
Right.
and
Mounted onto the plane.
Right. I think the Stukas had enormous dive brakes too that opened up when they dove to regulate the speed of fall. I'm sure they added something to the sound, but most of it was the sirens themselves. And then we just started experimenting with how to amp that up and how to make that more. It just had to say terror,
Right.
and unstoppable terror. There were very few anti-aircraft guns on the beach. They really didn't have much of a defense against these things.
Yeah.
The ships had some defense, but the faster ships could actually weave and move out of the way of the planes once they had committed to their dive. Because once they committed to the dive,
because the planes were that slow.
they couldn't. Well, once they had committed to their dive, and they were diving fairly fast, they couldn't like shift to the right or the left. They were committed, and they were going so fast that the plane actually had a self-correcting device on board, which, in case the pilot blacked out during the
dive.
term,
Really? Yeah.
that the plane would pull out and fly off into a certain direction, which became their Achilles heel, because the people on the ground began to realize, we know which way that plane's going to go when he pulls out of his dive, and that's where we're going to fire. So the siren was something that was mentioned a lot in the historical references, and we knew it would be very important. So that was one thing he mentioned when we first talked about Dunkirk. I had read the script. He just gave me kind of a brief, rundown of the things he was thinking, and of course a lot of that we moved on from later. It was a constant evolution, and I don't think Chris's genius is that he never stops searching and looking.
Right.
It's not a fixed. The script is not a fixed version of what the film's going to be. It's a blueprint which
he's exploring,
which one deviates from as one learns the film, and as the film is being discovered. And
so what's the editorial process like? So they go off and they shoot. At what point do you really start working with the film, and are you giving sound effects to Lee during the editing process, or how does that collaboration really work out?
Yeah, I start giving Lee sounds pretty early, and usually start on Chris's films about the time they stop shooting, roughly. Mm-hmm. At that point, I've been able to make some sounds for the film, recorded some sounds for the film. I've gotten out of the way the things that I can get out of the way. If I know that there are certain weapons or certain vehicles or certain planes or whatever, I'm trying to get those recorded early. So I'm ready with a
they're coming.
A library of material that I know we'll need. And as they are gearing up for the director's cut screening to the studio, we do a very elaborate temp mix, which is kind of the audio blueprint for what we're going to do. Blueprint's the wrong word. It's like the
proof of concept, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah, it's like, this is going to work. Now we're going to make it 100 times better.
Yeah.
But at least we know that we have, we're all on board with the same idea, and we know what we're doing, and we know, this is going to work. And so I start working with picture, shortly after they've stopped shooting. When Chris is ready to let me see something, start working with picture towards this temp mix for the studio screening, which is kind of the first time Chris gets the film up on its feet.
Right. I'm presuming because of where Chris is in his career, he doesn't have to go out and do a lot of audience test screenings for scores, but you say he shows the film to the studio, and are there other temp mixes that happen along in the process?
Yeah.
Or is it just kind of a rolling process of keeping things up to date?
Yeah. We do other temp mixes, and he does like to bring in audiences, and he does his own friends and family screenings, and
just to kind of see how the film's playing.
Yeah, he wants to see what's not making sense to people, and
it's probably important with a film like Inception, right?
Yeah. He wants to see how it's playing. And I think also, just as a filmmaker sitting in an audience, he can feel...
You feel the energy.
Feel how they're responding to the film. And he wants to reach as wide an audience as he can.
So do you guys, when after Chris is finished shooting, comes back, he starts working with Lee. Do you guys have a formal sort of spotting session and go through the film and he shares ideas with you? Or is it really sort of like you kind of start working on your own and send stuff back and forth? I'm kind of curious. I mean, what I'm really asking you is, how does he talk to you about sound and about what he wants and about what he's thinking?
Well, sound is such an abstract
Sure.
thing. Oh, you can't say it's not red enough or make it more blue, or it's, we found that it's good to have a starting point. And if I can begin sending them sounds, we have a point of reference that I can get feedback. And
it's not an abstract thing. It's like, how is this working?
Yeah. Then there's a definite thing, a sound which he can respond to.
Right.
And comment upon that. So it's really a matter of, I just start on the sequences that, sometimes he'll ask me to start on something specific, or I'll just start working on what, strikes me as being the most thing that jumps out at me first, and then start sending he and Lee sounds and get his feedback like that. So it's kind of a rolling spotting session that goes on
for months
till the end of the mix.
So I'm kind of curious about how that process goes. So, I mean, we're here in your sound design room at Warner Brothers. I'm looking around. Obviously, it's a 5.1 room, and you've got a euphonics console here. So, are you focused? Would you say your area of focus is mostly on the sound effects and design?
Yes.
And then you have obviously dialogue editors. And when you're first starting, working with Lee and Chris as the cut starting to come in, is how many people are on the crew? Is it pretty lean and mean at that point, or?
Yeah, we always have a pretty small crew. On Dunkirk, there were 2 sound effects editors, 1 dialogue editor, 1 ADR editor, 1 Foley editor, 1 assistant.
That's amazing to me, because I gotta tell you, when I saw the movie for the first time, and obviously it's much shorter than Chris's films, but there's so much detail in it and so much stuff going on. I thought this must have just been a massive amount of work for the sound team. Yeah,
but we did have a nice long schedule, so we were able to, and we worked very hard. And in addition to the editors, I also had, I think there were 6 or 7 sound effects recordists that recorded different things for me, and that was an ongoing process. But there's a tremendous advantage to working with the same people, and a lot of these people have worked with Chris before. The dialogue editor, Hugo Wang, has worked on all of Chris's movies that I've done, and knows his taste and knows what he likes. And Chris really likes to maximize the production tracks and mine everything he can from them. And Hugo's very good at that.
That must have been a particular challenge on Dunkirk.
It was. But even so, there were only a few, literally half a dozen loop lines at most.
Really? Interesting.
Almost no looping. So it was all salvaged from production recordings.
And then takes and all
and then
those
Gary
sorts of...
Rizzo did a wonderful job of cleaning up what he could with the IMAX cameras, and ultimately, I completely understand Chris's feelings about this, and I'm come to the same feeling myself through working with him. I think it's just very hard to get ADR to stick to the screen, and
because it just doesn't feel right.
Well, there's so many ways that it can go wrong, and a lot of them are very subtle ways. But I mean, we just try everything we can to salvage that production recording, because that's gold, and it's, that was what he shot, that was what he chose to use in the movie, and to have to loop it is almost like having to reshoot it. So, only in dire circumstances do we do any looping at all. There's a lot of group ADR in Dunkirk. All the extras on the beaches in France were French for the most part. So, and with the IMAX cameras, there wouldn't have been much to utilize anyway.
Much to use anyway, right? Yeah.
So we got a great loop group in London, and did the vast majority of our loop grouping in London with this loop group, and did a small bit here.
So I'm curious. You brought up Lee Smith, who's the picture editor, who I think you guys have. He's been cutting picture on all the movies for Chris that you've worked on sound. So I know Lee originally as a sound designer. We worked together years and years ago on a Jane Campion movie in Sydney. And so I'm curious for you, what's, obviously he's a picture editor who's thinking very critically about sound. So how's that collaboration for you with Lee being in the mix and obviously having a very strong point of view about sound as well?
I love Lee Smith. He's got great taste. His taste in sound is very much like mine. We think in the same ways. I really admire the work he did as a sound designer, as well as the work he's doing as a picture editor.
His work on Truman Show was really wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. Dead Calm too was a great sound job. So we have similar tastes. We both like things to sound real and to be evocative of the real world and not of the use of fanciful sounds, and like synthesized sounds is kept to a minimum. Daring in sound decisions, making a concerted effort not to follow the beaten path, but to really try to make the film feel fresh by utilizing different sound ideas, sound approaches, things that are surprising, unexpected. Lee and I have a great relationship. I really like him. We've worked together a lot.
Yeah.
On a couple of Peter Weir films and all of Chris's films.
And then, obviously the other huge part of the track in a Christopher Nolan film is Hans Zimmer's score. So one of the things that has been interesting to me, because I've gone back in the last week or so and taken a fresh look at some of the films, and I felt this to be especially true with Dunkirk, is I'm often really not sure if what I'm hearing is music or sound design. And I'm wondering tell me a little bit about the collaboration between you and Hans, or are you going to say we don't talk at all, and I hear the tracks for the first time when we show up on the mixing stage? But they fit so well organically together. It seems like there must be, a certain degree of collaboration.
Hans is the man. I love the guy, and his approach to music. I don't want to sound pretentious, but I feel like that's kind of my approach to sound design. He'll use anything that he feels is appropriate. He'll use a shitty out of tune piano that he got out of a dump, or he'll use a big piece of metal and bang it, or and make music out of that.
Right.
And so nothing's off limits with him. And every movie he does, he wants to push it and make it better and make it different, and like, in other words, never repeat.
Sure.
Was it Picasso that said it's okay to copy from other people but never from yourself? I think he's always looking to try something new and to top himself, and I admire that enormously and try to do that in my own work. To answer your question about collaboration, typically we don't talk very much. Typically what happens is he's going full tilt in his arena, and I'm going full tilt in my arena.
And you guys are both working at the same time, obviously, in parallel tracks to each other.
Right. And generally, Chris likes to play the sound effects and the music. He doesn't, with some exceptions, he doesn't, trade back and forth. There's not moments without sound effects and music. It is not.
Oh, that's interesting. So there aren't really moments where one steps forward and the other steps back.
Generally, certainly in Dunkirk, that's the case. Some of his other films, there have been moments where one has taken the lead over the other in a strong fashion. Hans is making the sounds that the audiences hear. I'm making the sounds that the characters hear. So I'm creating the world. I think of it as I'm creating the world that the characters are inhabiting. And that's the fun for me, which is to get to inhabit that world with those characters. And, when I'm working in a scene, that's what allows me to feel like I'm that guy running through the sand, feeling the crunch of sand under my feet, or being in a Spitfire cockpit. I'll keep working on it until I feel like, I can feel that I'm there now.
So you're using sound design almost to create the POV of the characters in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's kind of how I look at it. It's my way to voyeuristically participate in the movie and be there with the characters. And I would come in to work every day. I started working on this, we were working on it through the election and so on, but I just became so discouraged after the election, coming in here and being in 1940 all day and like climbing into a Spitfire cockpit, putting on my harness.
You're like, the outside world,
my leather.
The outside world is too terrible. I'm going to go to World War II for a while.
I just had, believe it or not, it was an improvement. I felt such a connection to this movie that I haven't felt in a long time.
Yeah.
Because I think this historical material was presented so accurately and emotionally and viscerally, and Chris, he really wanted to make he didn't want to be namby-pamby about it. He wanted to present war and all its horror and senseless, crazy brutality, and just make it as profound and and strong an experience as the audience as possible. And he milked music and sound effects for every bit of energy and emotion and also we started seeing these images that they were bringing back and Lee was cutting together, and it was so staggering that without any visual effects, it's all in-camera stuff with these large format cameras, and the images were just staggering and so inspiring, and we really had to work hard to live up to those images and to try to make the Spitfires sound as good as they look.
Right. One of the things that Chris has become famous for is he's a champion of analog film technology on the imaging side, and is really such a proponent of celluloid and shooting on film and 70 millimeter and large format. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of is there a similarity of approach to work with the sound side as well? I mean, obviously he's also kind of dependent on digital technology for sound because he couldn't achieve nearly the dynamic range or impact of his tracks if he were working on optical.
Yeah, Chris is not a Luddite. He doesn't not like technology because it's technology. It's only when you can't provide a better technology that he wants to stick with what's been around for years. And he feels the large format film cameras and presenting the film on film offers higher quality than he realizes that that's not the case with audio. That the tools we have now allow us to do things we simply couldn't do with no appreciable improvement in quality, sound quality.
Right.
It's not that he's old-fashioned. It's perfection. It's looking for perfection
and using the right tool for the right job.
Yeah.
Right. Well, of course, it wouldn't be a Chris Nolan film without some controversy around the soundtrack. And I'm just kind of curious about my impression as an outsider. Not, I've never met the man, I've never worked on any of the films, but it just seems like he's really adventurous about using sound in a different way. I'm thinking, some of the controversies like the treatment of Bane's voice in that last Batman film, or I think there was a lot of chatter on the internet with Interstellar around dialogue intelligibility, or there seems to be some chatter now on social media about the loudness in Dunkirk. So I think a lot of filmmakers, it's about getting a pristine, clean dialogue track and getting it out there. But Chris seems to take a different approach. And I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about that and sort of how do those conversations go with you guys on the dub stage?
Well, when you try to push the envelope, you're going to rub some people the wrong way. And whenever you try to do something new, there are going to be people that don't respond to that are put off by it because it's new, because that's not the way they've heard it before.
Right.
And that's not the way they do it.
Right.
So that's to be expected and, in fact, embraced. I mean, I think we would all be sort of disappointed if everyone said, if it was unanimity about the levels are perfect, it's all, I could understand all the dialogue, it was all, because there are moments when it's more effective to have the strain to hear the dialogue and to not quite catch every word. That's what life's like.
Right.
You know, Interstellar, the point of some of those sections of, for instance, the initial launch when they leave Earth, the dialogue is relatively unimportant, and they're in a rocket, for God's sake. They're having a conversation in a rocket. So
you wouldn't expect to be able to articulate it.
No, and I think it would be a little bit ridiculous, but people love to find something to complain about, and I think as far as overall level, I mean, we're sitting in there every day mixing at these levels. Right.
You don't mix on dim?
Very little, because you can't mix on dim. I can cut in dim. Yeah. But when I start pre-dubbing, I've got to go up. So I've got to go to level.
Do you pre-dub in here?
Yeah.
Okay.
I pre-dub the sound effects in here. Sure. So we bring the sound effects to the first temp dub in a package.
So you're showing up for the first temp mix with the sound effects and 5.1 that you've done in here.
Yeah. So we're cognizant of the levels. We're aware that when it hurts us and we turn it down. Right. Some of the prologue sections that we've done over the years for Chris's films typically are very loud because they're shorter pieces of film. You're talking
about like the sequence when the plane is ripped apart in the last Batman film.
Yeah, like in Dark Knight, there was the bank robbery. In Dark Knight Rises, there was the plane hijack. Right. We can push the levels harder in those because they're brief experiences before. Surrounded maybe by other trailers that are very loud. So when we go to the movie, we are aware of that and make an attempt to design dynamics in the track. And Chris has done that in the story. The story inevitably will have moments that are more gentle.
Well, I really noticed that again. I when I went back and took a look at Dark Knight this past week, that there's that tour de force set piece when Harvey Dent is being transferred in the police van, and there's the chase with the Batmobile, and the Joker is in the huge semi truck, and then and it's a huge sequence. But even internally to that sequence, you guys built in quiet moments. I'm thinking about I think when people think about that sequence, they think about the Batmobile turning and the sound of the wheels as it skids around curves and whatnot. But there's also that amazing shot when the truck flips over and there's the pop, and then the truck is airborne and the track almost becomes silent until the impact happens.
Now there's a Batman. Oh, you want to play? Come on. Come on. He missed!
So you guys are actually doing, I think, some really interesting stuff with dynamic range, and that prevents the audience from getting exhausted.
Yeah, and it makes that moment when the truck does hit even more dynamic. Right. And I think that's his point, was his point, especially in that film with music too, that if you, there's no music through that sequence, it begins when Batman emerges from the wrecked Batmobile in the Bat Pod, which we see for the first time. Right. So that's a really dramatic start for this great music cue. Sure. So Chris is very aware of the movements, if you could use a musical phrase for the film, and to not exhaust the audience, but just to add excitement by adding dynamics, and allowing that hit when the sound comes back to be even more forceful.
Yeah. Well, I was reading an interview with him in which I think he addressed some of the controversy around the Interstellar track. And he said, sometimes I think of dialogue as sound effects. And I thought that was just a really interesting take on what he's using to tell a story.
Interesting for a writer, no?
Right. That's right.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to speak for Chris, but I think that the experience, he wants the experience of watching one of his films to be a full body experience, not simply an intellectual experience. You're going to get the story through your ears and your eyes and your pores and your chest and every sense you have.
Yeah.
To make it strictly a following the story by following the words it kind of puts the audience on an intellectual plane where they're maybe a little more detached from the experience.
That's right.
So he really wants it to be, and I love the fact that he resists all trickery. No 3D, no. I think they use the D box in some of the theaters, but it's not a thing he approves of. So we're accomplishing that by using technology that's been around for years and audio formats that have been around for years. We mix in 5.1.
Right. And so the controversy about the loudness on Dunkirk, I found really interesting. So I mean, I saw the film here in Los Angeles in 70 millimeter, and it was loud, sure, but for me that was part of the point. Like that's the experience of being on that beach or in those planes when these things are happening. And it's not, to your point, it was specific, contained. It didn't last the entire film. I thought it was an appropriate use of the technology, but I'm wondering, do you guys have conversations about like, outside of Los Angeles or New York or some very well calibrated theaters, how is this going to play, for audiences, kind of out in the.
Well, the sad truth is it gets turned down, and that's just a given. I think that's a given for any film. It's going to get turned down to wherever they feel like they want to turn it down to, until Dolby makes that impossible for the 18-year-old projectionist to do. Then it's going to keep happening, and why should there be a volume knob on the cinema processor? I don't get that. I mean, it's
a conversation that we have a lot internally.
The directors aren't just they're not making content for TV that doesn't have a reference level.
Right.
The way it comes out of the mix stage is the way directors want to hear their film in theaters. And
but I certainly have had in my career in the sound business, and I'm sure you have as well, have had conversations with directors where they will say, well, we're going to mix this hot because we know the theater's going to turn it down. And you start to chase your tail around, right?
And that's a specious argument, because you
it's self-fulfilling at that point.
It's self-fulfilling at that point, for one thing, and you're not making the film you want to make. You're trying to somehow reverse engineer something that you shouldn't even be thinking about. I mean, so I think Chris's take is what we produce on the mix stage is what I would like to hear in every cinema.
Yeah.
And to your point about the level, I think it is appropriate to the subject matter, and it's not. It's really about eliciting an emotional response, and we find sitting on the dub stage, mixing his films, that we elicit the emotional response that we all feel.
And that's when you know
that he wants, and that's when we know we are onto something.
Yeah, I'm curious to talk a little bit more about Hans Zimmer and the music. So, are you getting any kind of sketches or hint of what he's up to while you're building, or are you really hearing that stuff for the first time on the mixing stage?
No, I hear it throughout, and he hears what I'm doing throughout. And the beauty of how Chris works is that by the time of that first temp mix, whatever visual effects are in the movie are there, and they're generally pretty complete. There's not a lot of stuff trickling in late. We're hearing the score. There's never a temp score. We're hearing Hans's music from the get-go. And
so you guys may not be having conversations and saying like, I'm going to take this this frequency range, you take this frequency range, but you're hearing each other's stuff and reacting to it and responding
exactly
to it.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And taking Chris's direction on I'll see he wants to do this musically in this section, then I'll do this.
Right.
So while there's no, I think it's almost better actually for Hans and I not to conspire with each other to divide the track up. I think it's much better for both of us to give it our all from the head pop to the tail pop, and then
you may have to make some difficult decisions on the dub
and then
stage,
sort it
right?
out later. What it generally involves is reducing one or two elements in the sound effects, or reducing a couple of elements in the music. It's generally not a wholesale,
Right.
replacement or
Sure.
It's just it
Ends up being a hybrid of the, yeah. And how involved is Chris during the mix? What's his profile? Because I've certainly, I think you and I both worked with directors that, just show up for a playback and give notes and leave. And then we've also worked with directors who have to be there for the pre-dubs, and you see all the different flavors of everything in between. So what is Chris's what's his profile during the mix?
He's there every day, all day.
Pre-dubs and final?
We don't pre-dub. The only pre-dubbing I do in here with sound effects, because it would be too much material to try to sort through on the
So there's
stage.
no dialogue pre-dub?
There's no dialogue pre-dubs. Gary does it on the fly, and when needed, Chris gives him time to dig into something and work on a section.
Really? So you guys, it's final from day one? And
Final from day one. Final actually from the first day of the first temp mix.
I see. Yeah.
And that's when we all probably have it the hardest, because Gary's scrambling to make the dialogue audible above all the racket that Hans and I are producing, and cleaning up camera noise. And
Boy, that first time you played the reel back must be a sobering moment.
well, it's generally not as bad as you'd think. I think we've all worked really hard to get it to that spot, and we know that this first temp mix is important, and it's intense, but it's and as I think a lot of films are doing now, we take that first temp dub, and then the next time we come back to do a temp mix, we start from that end point, right? So It's a rolling situation. Sure. And then when we start the final, which is usually about 6 weeks, we begin from that. So we're already beginning at a pretty good place.
Sure.
Where we know it sounds really good and it's working. Now what can we rethink? What can we
also,
do better?
really importantly, Chris is not hearing things for the first time at that stage. So there's no, I think we've all had that experience where, temp stuff the director falls in love with, and then you show up on the final mix stage with new tracks that they're.
Chris is really not like that. He will go for what's best.
Right.
And I've seen him throw things away that he's lived with for months because something is brought in that's better. But if what's in the temp tracks is the best thing and it's really working, then we stick with that.
Sure.
But he's very in the moment in making the movie, and very and responding to the film in the moment, and quite remarkably able to put all the preconceptions out of his mind. And at least that's my perception of him.
Yeah.
And just experience in the moment, and comes up with fabulous off-the-wall ideas that because of that.
Well, you've had the kind of fabulous good fortune in your career to work not only with Chris Nolan. So directors who are interested in using sound in an impressionistic way, not the way everybody else is doing it. But you've also worked with Paul Thomas Anderson, who I think has a wonderful design sense and an understanding of how to use sound. What was that collaboration like, and how is it different from working with Chris? Because you actually did Hard 8, so you were there right from the beginning of Paul's career.
Yeah, Paul is very very interested in sound. I had great fun working with Paul.
Because I got to say,
wasn't always easy.
No. And with the amazing visionaries, it never is. But Magnolia is one of my. I think it's an amazing movie and a fantastic track.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies too.
Yeah,
Paul is a visionary, and he is someone who I think more than Chris maybe has a little more of a notion of the end point. I think he seems to know exactly where he wants to go. Whether he gets there or not, I'm not sure exactly.
I think I see where you're going with it, but there's certainly directors, and I would put David Fincher in this kind of category that, like, I think he has a fully baked idea, and sometimes it's a challenge just to catch up to where he already is. Mm-hmm. And the way I hear you describing working with Chris Nolan, he's exploring and experimenting and playing through this process.
Yes, and we're constantly re-examining. We never stop trying to imagine what rules we can break, what we can do that we've never done before, that we haven't heard before in movies, what sounds we can use that would be interesting and unique and evocative. And whereas I think it sounds like a negative comparison, it's not meant to be at all.
Sure.
But I think Paul is more, he does have that blueprint in his mind. He does have that very unique Paul story structure that he's trying to clarify and guide the audience with, but someone who's also fascinated by unique and interesting and the odd sound that sort of makes the seem a little bit off kilter. Or
that's interesting. So you've had experience working with these kind of amazing, for lack of a better term, what we might call auteur, directors. But I noticed when I was looking through your credits again this morning, you've also worked with some directors who are, I would say, primarily known for doing other things. I'm thinking about Tom Hanks for that thing you do. But also I noticed you supervised Sam Shepard's film, Far North. And what was that experience like? I mean, I'm thinking about that this week, because obviously he's just passed away recently. And what was that experience like? That was obviously, and it was also pretty early in your career as well. Was he just focused on, like, I can imagine for sometimes writers are like, I just want to hear my dialogue.
No, this was a movie that took place in northern East Coast US. And he was very interested in the birds. He wanted, we really worked hard to get the birds right. Yeah. And he wanted certain bird calls. And I think it was that sort of finding the sound that
evoked the place for him?
Evoked not only the place, but a moment maybe. I think at one point they were walking down some railroad tracks, and he wanted that sound of gravel kind of falling down the embankment. He wanted little kind of sense memory cues that meant something to him.
And very specific things.
Very, very specific things, yeah. And
well, I wondered about that because I after he passed away, I was reading an interview that did an amazing revival of his play Fool for Love on Broadway a couple of years ago. And they were asking him about it. What's it like having your work kind of redone and revisiting on Broadway? And he said, it's a good production, really great, really good cast, great sound design, he said. And that just kind of surprised me coming from Sam Shepard, the playwright, that he even in the stage context, he was interested in the sound.
He was a lot of fun to work with. Great raconteur, obviously. And
I'm sure he could tell some stories.
Told some great stories. We mixed that film with Richard Portman.
Oh,
which was a really fun scene. Just
because Richard Portman was obviously a character in and of himself.
Character in himself, yes. And I think Sam had driven across country in his...
famously refused to fly, wouldn't fly.
Yeah. He drove across country in he had a BMW 7 Series when they had just come out, I think, or a 6 Series. Big, beautiful, black, awesome looking car. And but Sam was looking a little skeevy in those days. He had kind of long, greasy hair, and he didn't shave much, and he got to the California border, and the border patrol
thought he was running drugs in that
his
big car,
man. Sent the dogs in. He was incensed.
That was awesome.
But he was a character. And in fact, I went back they were cutting the film in Virginia, where he lived at the time, and went back there for a spotting session and ended up staying about a week. And we would just go out drinking every night. And what you do with Sam.
What magic was that? Going out and drinking with Sam Shepard.
And
it's one of the, I'm sure you get, I have these moments too, that sometimes something like that will happen, and you just sort of you can kind of drop into a moment of awareness, and you kind of pinch yourself, and I'm like, I get paid to do this.
Yeah.
This is awesome. right?
Yeah. I've been so fortunate, I feel like, in the directors that I've gotten to work with. Nicolas Roeg was another director that I just found so inspiring and so...
And somebody that Chris Nolan points to as kind of a filmmaking hero of his.
Yeah. He was somebody that would never tell you what to do. If you'd ask Nick a specific question, he would launch into this 5-minute story about he was walking home from school one day when he was a kid, and he thought he saw this shadow in the window, and he noticed it every day. And you know, after he was finished, he'd walk out of the room, and you'd kind of have to sit and think a minute and
You're
interpret, how do I know? What you'd realize is he answered my question.
Right. Because you're like,
he totally answered my question.
I just wanted to know if you wanted this louder, right?
But he totally answered my question, and in a much smarter way than just saying, I want that louder.
Yeah.
By putting you in the same kind of frame of mind as him.
That's really interesting. Well, just to wrap up, I kind of put a call out on social media if anybody had interesting questions to pose to Richard King. So I thought I would throw a couple of these at you and see if any of this is interesting to you. Carl Anderson is a really talented sound designer, does a lot of work with documentaries, has worked with Errol Morris, Carl. He want to know, at what point does story dictate use of sound, and how those conversations start with Chris? How does he let you know important story features for sound? And how do you add to that or even advance the conversation?
Well, I think it's all about story.
Right.
Everything we do is about story. I'm going to make sure I understand this question. I feel like everything that we do is in the service of the story and the characters, but the characters are part of the story. So to me, it's. I mean, when I'm working, I'm responding emotionally myself to what I'm seeing and hearing, and as soon as I do something that's not in keeping with the story, it
doesn't feel right.
It doesn't. I backtrack. Yeah, I mean, I think it's that story is king. It's what this is all about.
Yeah.
It's telling stories.
That's good. Brent Kiser, no relation to me, is a really interesting young sound designer. We met him on a movie called Swiss Army Man, which was directed by Daniel Scheinert and Daniel Kwan. Brent asks, we've seen crews get smaller and computers get smarter. What aspect of sound post needs an overhaul to keep up with the changing times?
What aspect of sound post?
Or you might say more time and more money.
Yeah, I mean, all that's true, and computers haven't gotten that smart, and unfortunately, and most of the time, I think if one were to look at the time I spend working, probably the time a lot of sound editors spend working, a lot of that time spent looking out the window,
right,
or scratching my head, or driving home from work and thinking about something and getting an idea.
Things that you used to do while you were waiting for the sound effects to come back from the, on mag from the library, right? But now that everything is instantly...
Then there was a crew of 40 sound editors, and you had very specific tasks to do. It's being able to work the way we work now and hearing all the tracks for a reel at the same time and being able to interact with those tracks. In fact, the film that I worked with you on first, Uncovered, was, I think, the first film that I did in a digital format.
Digitally, yeah.
It was, I did it on a Roland DM80, which was an 8-track, 16-bit recording device, an crude editing device.
Yeah.
But it was the best thing I had ever. It
was a game changer for you.
It was it allowed me to do what I had always wanted to do, which was to actually be able to compose the sound, and the interrelationships between different sounds.
Right.
And I think there's no better time to be doing this job than now. Yeah, the budgets are getting smaller and schedules are getting shorter. And sometimes the speed of computers is used as a weapon against us to take more stuff away, more time and money away. But it really is about the time it takes to come up with ideas. And if you're just going to sit and throw shit at the screen, then it's, you're not really...
And that artistry cannot be rushed.
Well put.
Richard, it's been fantastic talking with you today.
It's been fun, Glenn.
Do you, before we wrap up, is there anybody you want to give a shout out to? Your normal, who's on your team? Your Foley artists, that sort of thing.
Everybody did such a great job on Dunkirk. I got to say first, my first assistant, Andrew Bach, is amazing. He's my right hand, and he runs the show. And he knows film, he knows digital. He can fix computers. He understands the relationships between film and because we're working in the film world a lot with Chris's films.
Yeah.
So he's invaluable. Michael Mitchell and Randy Torres were the sound effects editors. Did amazing work. Worked their asses off. Michael Dressel was the supervising Foley editor. Hugo Wang, I mentioned earlier, amazingly talented, careful dialogue work. Just can't say enough good things about Hugo. And Dave Bach and Russ Farmarco kind of divided Dave had to leave halfway through the show, so they kind of divided the ADR job, which was in this case mostly group. It was a lot of group. Yeah. So they did that wonderfully. And John Rush.
That hack?
Yeah, that hack. Yeah, give him another chance. Give him another try.
He's the only Foley artist that we've done a Dolby Institute podcast around. Well, so there you go.
He and his team really threw themselves into this, and had a whole bunch of sand delivered and for the beach and found the right props, and we had to get these hobnail boots because that's what the soldiers wore.
What is a hobnail boot?
It actually had like tacks stuck in the bottom.
Really?
Which seems completely impractical. But I think the idea was if they were marching on dirt or like a dirt road, it'd be fine because it'd give you some traction. But if you're walking on a street, it's like, it's like
tap shoes.
Yeah. And so they made and found some hobnail boots and
he's very creative.
Did a really good job with the Foley, which was important in the show because there wasn't much.
Not a lot of dialogue, yeah.
Well, there wasn't a lot of usable production because of the cameras.
Because of the cameras, yeah.
And of course, Gary Rizzo and Greg Landecker, the re-recording mixers, who are part of the family, and it was Greg's last film. He retired after Dunkirk.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Goodness.
After a storied career of decades.
Of course,
multiple.
Well, what
Academy
a great movie to go
Awards.
out on.
Yeah, he's an amazing person, and did the dialogue, did the sound effects and music mix, and Gary handled dialogue, and everybody in the Warner Brothers facility here was terrific and knows the way Chris works, and everyone just gets on board. And,
this has been your home for a long time.
Yeah, and Chris has done almost all his mixes here.
Right.
So it's a very, very coherent, cohesive group of
you
people.
really do have a family here around that now.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much for taking the time and having this conversation. This is exactly why we wanted to do these podcasts, was to do a deep dive conversation on some of this stuff, and it's been really interesting and fun.
Well, good.
So
fun for me too.
Yeah, good, wonderful. So this is Glenn Kiser for the Dolby Institute and the SoundWorks collection, signing off from Warner Brothers. We've been talking with Richard King about his storied collaboration with Mr. Christopher Nolan. Talk to you next time.